the Nurses Doing GAMSAT podcast, brought to you by Thankfully GAMSAT. We're here to teach you how to smash the GAMSAT, get into medicine, and become a flippin' great doctor.
Welcome back to the Nurses Doing GAMSAT podcast by Thankfully GAMSAT. I'm Dr. Tom, founder and CEO of Thankfully GAMSAT. Now, once the March GAMSAT is over, a lot of our boot campers often ask us, what do I do now? What's the next step? Is it applications? Is it interviews? Is it the September GAMSAT? What do I do for each of them? And these are all great questions and very important ones, in fact, as well. And I'm going to cover those today, because this all depends on whether you feel confident about your March GAMSAT performance, or whether you feel like you messed it up, or maybe you're not sure. You know, when we've learned over the last 18 years of doing this, that each of those three groups is a bit different, and you need to take different actions depending on which group you're in, and we're going to address all of that today. But before we jump into it, a quick reminder to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss the next episodes, because we're going to have a lot of great content on this coming to you in the next few weeks and months. And I'm also going to be giving you a ton of free resources today. And you can find all of those resources in the show notes, which you can get at thankflipgamsat.com/episode 14. That's the number 14. It'll all be linked in there for you. And so I recommend you head on over there. But let's talk about what the situation. So the situation is such that, you know, every year at this time, you know, you've been busting your ass for the March GAMS. And some of our boot campers, they've been working really hard. It's like kind of like a steam train. You've gotten so much momentum, and then all of a sudden, once the GAM's over, like, what do you do? Like, what do you do with your hands? What do you do with your time? What do you do now? And people often ask us, you know, where do I go to from here? So, and what happens next? When do my results come out? So I want to run through the timeline. That's the first thing I want to do today. Because you need to know what happens when, and then we'll talk about the significance of each of those events and what to do to prepare yourself so that this March or January next year, you're getting into medicine. All right, so here's the timeline. We're going to run through the timeline, then we're going to go into detail on each of them in a sec. So just as an overview, firstly, the results, the GAMSAT results will be released in mid-May. All right, in mid-May, the results will come out. Then, only 2 weeks later, on the 31st of May, the GEMSAS applications close. So the applications for the medical schools close only 2 weeks after the GAMSAT results are released. The non-GEMSAS medical schools close their applications in June. And in a second, I'll tell you the distinction between GEMSAS and non-GEMSAS. But then at the very end of August, right? So you submit your applications at the end of May or in June. And then at the end of August, you'll receive an interview offer. And if you receive an interview offer, the interview will only be held like 2 or 3 weeks later. So there's not much time there. Right. In September, they hold those interviews. And that's about the same time as the September GAMSAT is happening. So there's a lot happening at that time of the year. And then in early November, they release the offers after the interview. So you've done the interviews. Do you get an offer for a medical school? You'll know in early November. And then in late January, you begin medicine. All right. So let's just recap that. Mid-May, GAMSAT results are released. End of May, applications for medical schools open. Some of them are in June, but most of them are in end of May. Then at the end of August, you hear whether you got an interview or not. If you got one, you'll sit it 2 or 3 weeks later in September. And that's about the same time as the September GAMSAT. And then in early November, you receive the offer for a medical school, and then you start in late January. All right, so let's dive into each of those, because each of those, as with all things GAMSAT, can be complicated and are not as straightforward as they seem. So firstly, when the results are released in May. So in 2024, the results came out on Friday, the 17th of May. In 2023, the results came out on Thursday, the 18th of May. So it's around that 17th, 18th at the end of the week time. And it really just depends on how fast ASA can process all the numbers and the statistics and whatever the hell they do back there, right? That's when the results will be released. Kind of that mid-May time in, 17th, 18th end of that week. But what's really important there is that when the results are released, you need to understand what they actually mean. Now, we're going to have further episodes on going into more detail on this, but just to give you a bit of an insight, the result you get is what's called a weighted GAMSAT score, meaning that section 3 is worth twice as much as the other 2 sections. So the way they get your overall GAMSAT score is they take section 3, they multiply it by 2, they add sections 2 and 3, and they divide the whole lot by 4, and you get your overall GAMSAT score. Now, that's what majority of the medical schools use, but some of them want to get a bit fancy and they use an unweighted GAMSAT score, which means that all the 3 sections are worth the same. All right, so that's something to think about. The point there is that the GAMSAT score isn't always as straightforward as it seems, but we'll go into this in more detail in a second. Then you also at that point need to have calculated your GPA. Now, this is on a 7-point scale. And it's not necessarily the GPA that's written on your transcripts from your university. It's what the medical schools consider to be your GPA. Now again, this gets a little bit complicated, but we don't have time to go into it today. We actually have a whole podcast episode on this. If you want to know more about GPAs, go to episode 6, Is My GPA High Enough? We go into all sorts of details there on how to calculate it, what is a high GPA, what if it's not high enough, what do you do, that kind of stuff. Because what you've got to consider, what you may not know is that the medical schools kind of, during the application process, they all have their own opinion on what they think makes a great medical student. And the GPA is one of the things that they kind of fiddle with. So some of them will look at your GPA differently than your medical school. And I have a particular story about this because years ago we had a GAMSAT candidate come to us in tears, and she was saying, Dr. Tom, I don't know if I can actually get in. I don't know if I can achieve my dream. I think my GPA is too low. Because what happened is that she had called up the University of Sydney, the admin there, and said, hey, this is my GPA. This is what my medical school has given me as not my medical school, my undergrad has given me as my GPA. Is that high enough for you, Sid? And she goes, no, it's not high enough. You're never going to get in with that score. Yeah, not exactly those words, but very close to it. And so she was crushed and she was literally in tears, came to us and said, is this true? And we said, well, look, not quite. You need to go and run your university scores through their system. And University of Sydney is a bit different. They use the UAC system. You apply to them separately. And once she ran her undergrad courses and her scores through that system, she actually had a higher GPA. And the GPA was higher so that she can actually very comfortably apply and be in a good position. So when it comes to the GPAs, it's important to calculate it in the GEMSAS system. So let's talk about GEMSAS and non-GEMSAS for a second. So GEMSAS is essentially they call it a consortium of medical schools, which kind of sounds like a drug cartel. But essentially they've gone, a whole bunch of these medical schools have gone, you know what, this is too hard. You guys take care of this application process for us. And so GEMSAS has gone, all right, we'll take care of it. And what you do is you submit one application to GEMSAS, and that applies for 10 of the 14 medical schools that are out there that take, or in Australia that take GAMSAT. And so you apply for GEMSAS and you put your preferences of your top 5 medical schools. And then you get one interview offer. So again, this is going to it gets a bit complicated. But the important thing is that when it comes to your GPA, you go and you implement it into the GEMSAS system. They do it for free for you in there. Now, don't use any other kind of gimmicky online GPA calculators because they're potentially misleading and you don't want to make that mistake at this stage. So go to the GEMSAS one and there'll be a link in the show notes to that for you. So once when it comes to the GEMSAS applications, right? So in mid-May, you get your GAMSAT result. Then by the 31st of May, you need to have made some pretty big decisions, right? You've got to decide which of the medical schools you're going to put down as the top 5 and which order as well. And this is a big deal it's not, the application process isn't just a case of I'm going to put it in and then the system will give me I've got the marks. And so the best thing, I'll get the school that I want, no matter how I put my preferences in. No, it doesn't work that way. You could have the marks to get in, but if you put the wrong preference order, you could miss out completely. Whereas someone with lower marks, if they play their cards right with the preference orders, they can get an interview and get into a medical school. Like, this is the crazy thing. It's good. The GEMSAS system's good in the sense that, you get thrown back into the pool and all these different fancy things that they do, which we'll talk about in other episodes. But the thing to remember here is that it's not as straightforward as it seems. And we specialize in this in the postgraduate GAM or post-GAMSAT application interview process. And we've developed methodologies and approaches that you're not going to find anywhere else. And people often come to us, confused, wondering, hey, can I actually get in and get an interview? And they end up getting one because, there's a way to approach this. The other thing is that there are things like the CASPER test that people don't consider. This is a kind of an online, they call it a situational and social judgment test, which is essentially they give you all these different scenarios and questions that you do on an online platform. And they have these external raters that kind of determine whether you're appropriate for a medical school. And 2 medical schools have implemented that recently, but it is something to consider, to be aware of, because and the other thing is that the medical schools all have different bonus points that they'll offer you depending on what your background is and what you qualify for. For example, if you're a nurse or a clinician, some of the schools are better for you than others. And if you're rural or international, then the process is completely different, right? So the point I'm trying to get to you here is that the application process is often overlooked, right? But there's far more to it than people realize. There are 14 postgraduate medical schools that take GAMSAT in Australia. 10 of them, as I said, are part of the consortium, of the GEMSAS consortium, where you put in your preferences and you're given one interview and one offer. And then 4 of them have gone, no, we want to do it ourselves. And they've pulled out of that, or they've never been a part of it. And you have to apply for those medical schools individually. So essentially, if you apply for everything available out there, you'll make 5 separate applications. 1 for the GEMSAS system, and then 4 for each of the individual ones. Unlikely for you to be doing that because of the requirements. But just hypothetically, if you could, that's up to 5 applications. Generally speaking, people put the maximum of 3. I mean, last year we had boot campers who got interviews with 3 medical schools, which is fantastic. And one of them got offers from 2 of them and had to pick between 2 medical schools, which is a good problem to have. But look, if you're confused about this process, that's why I'm bringing this to you now so that you can start to prepare for it. All right. Because if that wasn't bad enough, the medical schools tend to change their application requirements most years, right? And the process evolves. Like, for example, Notre Dame and Wollongong, they scrapped the portfolio process. Like last year, Wollongong blew everyone's minds by getting rid of the portfolios and just creating a whole set of bonus points that you could apply for. Where I think Notre Dame did that the previous year, they removed the portfolio completely and they added Casper and all. So it keeps on evolving. And so that's why it's important to really take this process seriously. Because another example here is that the University of Sydney scrapped interviews altogether, whereas the University of Queensland brought them back a few years ago. And then there are things that the medical schools won't even tell you, like the fact that the University of Queensland tend to favour rural students, even for their Commonwealth sponsored spots. And Griffith is one of the most competitive medical schools on GAMSAT score, while UWA is probably the most competitive on GPAs. And so all of this stuff plays in to, where should you even consider applying? What order of preferences? And, will you get a position or not? And so this is an opportunity, right? Because if you inform yourself on this, and if you're proactive about this, where you can beat the other people who are just kind of cruising along and thinking that everything will be hunky-dory, which when it's not. And like I said, we're going to have episodes covering this moving forward. We even have an applications and interviews boot camp If you want to know more about that, I'll put a link in the show notes where we kind of help you and walk you through step by step through all of this. So should you be starting interview prep early at this point, or immediately after GAMSAT? Well, that depends. Only if you're really confident in your March performance. And, there are people in that position, and that's fantastic. And if that's you, then first you should take a break. Right? Take a break. If you're in that first group, take a couple of weeks off, have a bit of a rest. You deserve it. You've been busting your ass. And then start looking at the application process first, right? Because first we need to make sure that you actually get an interview, and then start looking at actually preparing for the interview. So let's kind of go through the three different scenarios. Let's say that you've either you think you got a great score on March. Maybe you feel like you've completely messed it up and you're doing September, or maybe you're not sure. So let's go through all three of those. So the first one, like I just started talking about a second ago, is that you're feeling completely confident and you think you're going to do really well. Maybe you've already got a pre-existing GAMSAT score that's really high. So in that case, what you would do at this point is start looking at the medical schools and comparing their entry requirements. And if you want to see them laid out side by side with all the entry requirements, and so you can see where you stand in one really easy resource, you should go to our med school info site. We've put that together to be the easiest and most effective way, and it's a free resource you can use. I'll put a link in the show notes where it just compares the schools side by side, and you can start to all 14 of them, in fact, GEMSAS and non-GEMSAS, all laid out there for you so that you can see where you stand, where you would consider applying, and then make sure that you're fulfilling those requirements. Take any actions you need to. Figure out that your GPA, and once you've got all that sorted, start looking at early interview prep. And for you guys, I'd really recommend our applications and interview bootcamp, where we simplify the whole application process for you, and we guide you through the interview process as well. Just to give you a bit of an insight, last year, our GAMSAT boot campers who got interviews, 100% of them who got interviews got offers for a medical school, right? So that's how effective our interview boot camp is. When it comes to the people who didn't do our GAMSAT boot camp, but they just did the interview boot camp, it's not quite as high as 100%, but it's still up there. So that's what you guys should be doing. That's kind of the flow for that group. Then the second group, the people who feel like they've completely messed up March. And if that's you, then I'm sorry to hear that. But I understand, because that was literally my experience, my first GAMSAT experience. As soon as I walked out of my first GAMSAT, I remember that it was in Sydney at the old convention center in Darling Harbour. And I just thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to need to do this exam again. And I put together my plan. I think I took a week off after that, and I started studying again. And it was a lot better the second time. So for you guys, if you feel like you've messed it up, I understand. And what we need to do at this point is, before you do anything else, we need to create a plan for how things are going to be better for September. Because it's not a given that you're going to do better in September, just because you've done the March one. So what's really important is that you get that updated plan or a better plan sorted out. And in fact, we know that how important, because I know personally how important that is. We're giving you guys free mentoring sessions where we will sit down with you and help you to create an updated, better study plan. It's called Your GAMSAT Study Plan. It's a free one-on-one session. And again, that's in the show notes for you guys to get started. So once you've had that session and once you have a plan for September, at that point, you can take a week or two off, right, and have a bit of a rest. But not before you have that plan. And I really want to emphasize this, because it's very easy to go, I'll do it in a couple of weeks. And then, the time runs away. It's another month and two, and then you've got uni, and then you've got holidays, and you've got other things coming up. And before you know it, it's a month out from the games again, and you're panicking. So we don't want that. So take this opportunity, book one of those free sessions, and get that plan sorted. Because at that point, you can take a couple of weeks off, and then hit the ground running with your GAMSAT preparation for September and really change it up. And that's the key here, right? If you've done the GAMSAT before, there's no point doing more of the same. So if what you did last time was, well, you didn't do any preparation, then we need to change that and start preparing early. And if your preparation was pretty much just memorizing sciences and doing practice questions, then we need to change that, right? You should refer to, I think it's episode 2, about how to beat the science students at their own game, where we talk about how to effectively study for the science section, because it's not just about memorizing formulas and then doing practice questions. There's a lot more to it. But yeah, that's what you guys should do. That's the plan for that group. Now, the third group, I'm not sure. It could go well. It could not. I'm not quite sure. But I want to cover both bases. And that's what you guys should be doing, covering both bases. It's kind of the toughest group to be in, because you have to, despite applying, and this is what I say to my boot campers, if they're applying and they're doing the September GAMSAT, you have to act as if you're not applying at all. Because if you're studying for the GAMSAT and you're kind of going, oh, you know what, fingers crossed that application works out, because then I don't have to really push myself with the GAMSAT study, what you'll find is the GAMSAT study is not adequate. It's not good enough. So what I would recommend for you guys is, like the previous group, before you do anything else, get yourself your GAMS study plan session and get a solid plan together on what you're going to do to improve for September. Once you've done that, then start to look at the application process, like with the first group. Look at that med school info site to see what you could potentially apply, so that when your results are released, you can move quickly. And it's not like this long drawn out process of decision making, but all right, it was too low, I can't apply anyway, scrap that, I'm going to focus on September. Or I can apply, you do your application, and then you forget about it and you focus on September anyway. Right. And then the question often comes, like, what happens if I'm preparing for September and I get an interview? Well, at that point, we focus on both, really. And we sometimes get boot campers in that position, and we always put them into our interview boot camp and make sure that they're covering the interview as a priority, and then secondary, the GAMSAT. However, with that said, if you do apply, you need to pretend like you didn't apply, because even though it's your second GAMSAT or maybe your third, who knows, but even though you're repeating the GAMSAT, you still need to put in 100% of your effort, 110%, because it's not going to be easier the second time. Oftentimes people find that it's more challenging, not because they don't know the topics, but because they have all this self-doubt, all these worries and all these concerns, like, can I do this? All that kind of head stuff that comes up. And that's where the mindset component of GAMSAT that we talk about, that Marie often talks about, is really important. And I like to say that GAMSAT is about a lot more than just the physics and the poetry. It's also about this kind of personal growth of how do you face the potential of failure and give it your all despite that. Because for a lot of people doing the GAMSAT, they've cruised through, they've passed everything, and they've never really faced the potential of a crushing failure. Well, obviously, we don't want that to happen. And hopefully that doesn't happen. But for some people, it does. And how do you recover from that? Like, that's what happened to me. Twice, in fact. The first time when I did the GAMS, like I said, I walked out of that exam going, I really butchered that. I'm going to need to do it again. Then the second time, I actually improved my GAMSAT score. I got an interview with the University of Sydney, but then I did the interview and they rejected me from the interview. Like, let me tell you, getting a bad GAMSAT score is one thing, but when they actually meet you and they get to know you, and then they're like, nah, we don't want you around, that feels personal, and it is. And so I had to recover from that. And so I inherently know what it's like to struggle with this process. And I also know what it's like to overcome that and to thrive despite it. And I think that's what makes me and my team so good at this, because we didn't just kind of cruise through the first time and go, I don't know, I just did some practice questions and it worked out. No, we had to really figure it out and understand this exam and what it takes to thrive. And that's what makes us good at teaching you guys this stuff. All right, so there you have it. That's what's happening next. That's what you need to do depending on your situation. If you have any further questions or you want clarification, head on over to our Facebook group called Nurses Doing GAMSAT, which is accompanying this podcast. And head on over to the show notes to get all the resources that I mentioned. There'll be a few others in there, like a link to the GEM stuff and a whole bunch of cool things that you'll need. And you can get that by going to thankflipgamsat.com/episode 14. See you in the next episode.
Hey, I have a cool gift for you, just for listening to the Nurses Doing GAMSAT podcast. We do some of our best work in our Facebook group called, you guessed it, Nurses Doing GAMSAT. It's free to join, and every day we're sharing actionable guides, tips and tricks, and really just how to smash the exam and get into medicine. You can join today by searching Nurses Doing GAMSAT on Facebook. Thanks for listening to another episode, and I'll see you next time.